Good morning, everybody. Hello. It's so good to see all of you here. If you're new to my channel, Modern Metaphysicae, welcome. My name is Dustin, and this channel is about all things esoteric and occult related. And today we are going to be doing a deep dive into the Wheel of Fortune. So if you're new to this series on my channel, what we do is we look at the history and visual evolution of each of the major arcana in the tarot, specifically the Rider-Waite Smith. So I hope each of you has a cup of tea or some coffee and your favorite tarot decks around you, and we're going to dive into how the symbolism and depiction of this tarot card has evolved over time, how it was influenced by history and art history, and take a look at how the divinatory meanings evolved over the course of 100 years of tarot history. As always, there is an accompanying blog post to this series, and you can find that down in the description box below. It's also pinned in the chat if you're watching the live chat. Down in the description box, you'll also find links to all of my social media where you can reach out and connect, as well as a link to my personal website where you can book a tarot reading with me. And if you missed the last newsletter that went out, I am offering some pretty cool new tarot readings, so be sure to go check those out. And yeah. What else? Oh, as always, with my live streams, if you have a question or comment that you would like me to see or read, be sure to do @ModernMetaphysicae in the chat so that it highlights it nice and bright for me, or put it in all caps. If I do miss it, I apologize, but just keep posting your question or your comment, and I'll be sure to see it at that point, and you won't get in any trouble or get banned or anything. So yeah, let's see here. Are we skinny dipping or suiting up for a dive? I don't know. That's totally up to you. Yeah, good morning. Good morning. Goodness, there's like over 35 people here already. Whew. All right. Coffee. My first coffee of the day. So yeah, let's dive in. Because the Wheel of Fortune is a pretty dense little card, right? So, like I mentioned earlier, as always, I do have a blog post written for this. If you are interested in following along or using it for notes or whatever, you can head over to my website, which is modernmetaphysicae.com. And at the very top here, you will see the word blog. And if you click on that, it will take you to the lovely blog page. Now here you can also filter everything down so you can see specific posts about astrology, for example, or specific posts about tarot. And in the tarot one, you will find the latest post, which is the Wheel of Fortune deep dive. So we're going to dive into this. So yeah, the Wheel of Fortune. Ooh, we're going to put this up on the screen for starters here. The Wheel of Fortune. Ooh, it's a big one. Where do we start with the Wheel of Fortune? Or the Rota Fortunae. It's a card that symbolically is deeply, deeply ingrained in the sort of societal and religious and social theologies of the world, right? We see this symbol crop up time and time again across the world, right? Regardless of religion, of region, of traditions, anything like that. There's always this kind of idea of time being cyclical, and that things come and go in good and bad, right? There's always this balance of light and dark. And the Wheel of Fortune, as we see it in the tarot today, right, takes its roots specifically from a depiction of the Wheel of Fortune that we see in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But historically, this symbol goes back much, much further. And what's on your screen right now is what is called, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, and I deeply apologize if I am, but it's the Bhavakara, which is the Wheel of Becoming. It's a traditional Indian Buddhist depiction, basically, of the Wheel of Fortune in some sense, right? Now, scholars and sort of occultists both see that the Wheel of Fortune probably takes its roots in ancient Babylon, where the actual Wheel of Fortune is the zodiacal wheel, right? When we talk about the zodiac, we talk about a ring of constellations that encircle the planet, right? And that ring is the ring of fortune, right? And or the wheel of fortune, the zodiacal wheel, and we still use the term zodiacal wheel today. And so, in terms of the most ancient origins of that symbol, that's probably where we see it align most with what we know today. However, it's potentially true that symbol goes even further back into prehistory. And one of the symbols that people debate constantly, right? I mean, just to the T, is the sun disk, or the equal-armed sun cross. There's a lot of different sort of terms, but this is a petroglyph from the Three Rivers petroglyph site. And this symbol that we see is a symbol that is everywhere on the planet. Any prehistorical sort of society, whether you're in the Middle East, or you're in Asia, or you're in Africa, or you're even here in the United States, this symbol crops up. And there's a lot of people who associate the symbol with the sun. It is a symbol that we see in alchemy as well. And so the symbol itself takes on different meanings, but one thing that scholars recently have been talking about is its connection to this idea of the cycles of time and the seasons, right? There's 4 sections of the circle. There are 4 seasons. You kind of, again, get this idea of the wheel of fortune, right? This cycle that all of us experience and go through, right? So in terms of, this symbol being a part of our culture, of the human experience, right? Again, we see this tradition of it being included in the tarot because it is so ingrained, right? It is so universal. When we talk about the Wheel of Fortune, it's a very universal symbol and ideology that seems to be universal across cultures and across the continents, across the world, long before we even had, or supposedly long before we even had, cultural interaction, right? So, however, that date keeps getting pushed further and further back as they keep finding more and more things, like Egyptian hieroglyphs in Australia, and Viking sites in the middle of America, and things like that. So hello everybody that is just coming in. Hello Danny. Hello. So yeah, it's a symbol that is just as important to basically every culture on Earth as every other symbol within the Major Arcana, which again is likely why it was included. Now, we still to this day have no idea who originally came up with the original Major Arcana and how that came about and why they chose what they chose. All we're doing is making inferences and best guesses as to this, right? Yeah. Canaduck in chat says that it also looks like a natal chart. Right, yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of connections there, right, that we can draw. Now, the Wheel of Fortune that us as tarot readers, right, are probably most familiar with is something like this. The image that you see on the video right now is from the Codex Baranus, which is a Wheel of Fortune. And what this represents and why it was used was it was a religious allegory that basically taught the common folk why kings were kings and why they were peasants, right? The idea of everybody having their place, but also that even kings, right, could fall, right? So if we look at this image, we see in the middle, we basically have God, right? The King of Kings, who is not someone who has to worry about the Wheel of Fortune, so he's kind of in the middle of it. We have a king, right, Regno at the top, and then we have the king falling, right, and his little crown's falling off on the right-hand side, and we have, him basically being at his worst at the bottom, and him kind of rising back up to be a king on the left-hand side. Now, this symbol specifically is taken from earlier depictions of the Wheel of Fortune being depicted with the goddess Fortuna, who was the Greco-Roman specifically. It is the Roman name for this deity, the Roman goddess of fortune and luck, right? And she was often seen sort of next to this spinning wheel of fortune. And interestingly enough, we still see this crop up in medieval manuscripts and even in things like Bibles, where you have this figure and she's either depicted as like a noble woman, kind of like spinning the wheel of fortune, or you see her depicted as an angel, right? Which is really, it's always fascinating to me to see how the Catholic Church took concepts and ideas from pagan traditions like the Wheel of Fortune and the goddess Fortuna, and then adapted them and used them, right, as religious allegory in order to teach the common people, because one, right, most religious sermons and religious sort of events were held in Latin or done in Latin, and most people didn't speak Latin, especially if you lived, somewhere, in what is modern day France or Spain, for example. And not only that, most people were illiterate, right? Wait, it's not Vanna-White. No, not Vanna-White, but Vanna-White is the modern day equivalent of Lady Fortune. But that is a good point, right? Like, Wheel of Fortune is so ingrained in our society that even to this day, right, it is a trope, right? It is a meme that continues to play a part in our culture, right? Which is very fascinating. So this sort of depiction of the Wheel of Fortune, again, is probably something a little bit more like we're used to seeing, especially when we talk about like Taramasse or the early Visconti decks or something like that, right? So again, it's the sort of symbolism that's being presented here. You always have sort of Lady Fortune. Sometimes she's blindfolded, sometimes she's not. The blindfold, again, in a similar way to the Lover's card with the Cupid being depicted on that card, the idea of it being unbiased, right? Like, it doesn't matter who you are. You could be a king, you could be a pauper, and those roles can be reversed at the, the blink of an eye, and Lady Fortune is fickle, and she she doesn't judge, right? Everybody is equally as susceptible to falling down the Wheel of Fortune as they are climbing up the Wheel of Fortune. But again, you get these two strong depictions in the medieval and Renaissance period, whether it's Lady Fortune with spinning the wheel in some regard, right? Or you have this very specific religious allegory context of God being at the center of the Wheel of Fortune, and the idea that God controls the fates and that everybody has their place, and the idea that even kings can fall, right, to God, which is how the church maintained their power over kings, right? It's really fascinating, and we could talk about this for hours, but that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about tarot, right? So let's dive into sort of the visual evolution of the tarot cards. So one of the very earliest depictions or tarot decks that we have access to, again, is the Visconti decks. Here we have from one of the Visconti decks the Wheel of Fortune, and here we have kind of a combination, in a sense, of the previous sort of Renaissance and Middle Age depictions of this symbol, right? We have Lady Fortuna in the center, so she's taking kind of that god position where she's in control. We have a figure at the top who is holding an orb, right? And again, this is symbolic of power, so we have this idea of king or nobility. And then we have someone falling, someone climbing, and then this poor old guy with the wheel on his back, who does not look very comfortable or very happy in any way, shape, or form, right? So very traditional imagery here. There's nothing that strikes us as different or dramatically jumping into some realm of the unknown, right? This is very traditional, allegorical, historical depiction of the Wheel of Fortune that references not only Greco-Roman depictions of the Wheel of Fortune, but also directly references the religious allegorical sort of depictions of this symbol from the time, right? So, pretty standard, right? Everyone's making Hunger Games and Game of Thrones references in chat, and I live for this. Very true. All right, so then we're going to jump ahead in time a little bit. We're going to dive into here. This is the Dedal Tarot. Now here we get the sort of traditional wheel in the sense, but we start seeing some different figures appearing. We have a little bit of a sphinx and some creatures, right? So this is a little different. Now, we don't know why these symbols were specifically chosen. There's no documentation. There's no extant primary source material that tells us why these specific creatures were chosen. There's a lot of academic debate and things like that, but we'll see these guys continue to sort of stick with us as we go through time. Some of it, I think, has to do with when we look at the Marseille, we start to see this separation of tarot from, this is completely my conjecture on this. When we look at the history of Marseille as a whole, we start to see the separation of religious iconography from the Major Arcana, especially when we start talking about like Besançon decks and things like that. So I think it might be something to do with that, where they were leaning more into like, well, let's make this less about the church and more about, sort of myth and legend. But again, that's completely here nor there. I have no actual evidence. That's just my opinion. But yeah, we can see we still have that sort of traditional wheel that's being turned, and then we get some figures on here that will make an appearance later that we'll talk into when we dive into the symbolism of the cards itself. Now, when we get to Pappas, as he so eloquently does, gives us, some really deep esoteric things going on here, right? So we have the Star of David or the Tetragrammaton. We have, very, very clearly depicted a serpent or a sort of an alligator. We have a Caduceus. We have the Sphinx, right? There's a lot of esoteric symbolism here, right? And of course, it leans heavily into that idea of tarot and its Egyptian origins, which we now know today to be untrue. But, nonetheless, he really enjoyed that. And then we get to Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith. And again, we see a lot of these symbols stay true. The wheel, however, becomes more of like a disc seal than, a sort of like spinning wheel or water wheel. And there's a ton of other symbols that crop up. So again, we have that idea of the serpent and the sort of dog figure and the Sphinx. We have these 4 winged creatures on the corners of the card that are all reading books. So there's a lot of symbolism here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith specifically in this card, and they even say so in Pictorial Key to the Tarot, were referencing Levi's work. So, that directly influenced Pappas and the whole 9 yards. So there's a lot of connection there and a lot of purposeful sort of nods to those earlier esoteric decks. And then as we move forward in time, we get to good old Aleister Crowley, and we can see, again, a very traditional image here. So the wheel goes back to more of a wheel-looking thing, but it's still kind of abstract, as much of the Thoth Tarot is. And we still have those symbols. Again, we have the alligator serpent symbol, the Sphinx, and this sort of monkey that we see earlier on. So the figures there change a little bit. But again, their meanings stay relatively the same when we're looking at sort of the divinatory meanings of the cards. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of the card's visual evolution, right, the changes are subtle and they are distinct, right? They do become more esoteric, and they distance themselves clearly from the sort of mundane, right? But the symbol and the card itself, the design of it, visually, stays pretty consistent through time, right? There's not, there's nothing crazy here that's being changed. Like we see in some other cards, like the Magician, right? The Magician is one of my favorite cards because the visual depiction and the meaning of it changes so dramatically over time. I need some more coffee because I can't talk. And again, if anyone has any questions or anything in chat, feel free to throw them in. You guys are quiet today. There's like 50 people watching and chat is just like silent. So if you have any questions or anything like that, throw them in there. So yeah, the visual evolution is pretty linear, right? Nothing crazy there. Now let's dive into sort of the evolution of the meaning of the card, right? So early on, right, when we're talking about Demolay, again, his meanings are so simple and so eloquent, right? We have the Wheel of Fortune, the injustice of the fickle goddess, which I just love. The fickle goddess, right? So again, heavily leaning into that Fortuna sort of tradition, that Greco-Roman mythos. And then when we get to Eliphas Levi, we have the Hebrew letter Yod, the Wheel of Fortune, principle, manifestation, praise, manly honor, the phallus, fire, fecundity, and paternal scepter. So interesting, right? When we talk about Levi here, because he leans heavily into this masculine energy. When we get to Mathers in 1888, he calls it the Wheel of Fortune, good fortune, success, unexpected luck. When we get to the Golden Dawn in 1896, we have the Magus of the Voice of Light. I love the Golden Dawn titles. They're like so epic and ridiculous. The Prophet of the Gods. The Hermit. Wait, that's wrong. The Golden Dawn one is wrong. That is the old one. That is for the... that is for the Hermit. It must have gotten reverted when I was writing this, and I didn't see that last night. Let me quickly pull this up, and we'll change it after the video here. I'll go through and edit that back. We will do a correction. 1 second. Here we go. Okay. So... we are talking about the Golden Dawn here. So this is the Lord of the Forces of Life, the Wheel of Fortune, good fortune, and qualified happiness is the correct, terminology or meaning here. And I'll correct that after the live video here. Oopsies. It happens. Listen, I'm one person. I don't have editors. Like, I'm doing this all on my own. Late at night in my bed. Then when we get to Waite calls it the Wheel of Fortune. Again, his meaning for the card is very simple. Fortune, success, elevation, luck, and happiness. And then when we get to Crowley, of course, he is very eloquent with his words and describes the card thusly. This card represents the universe and its aspect as the continual change of state. Above the firmament of the stars, these appear distorted in shape, although they are balanced, some being brilliant and some being dark. From them, through the firmament, issues light. They churn it into a mass of blue and violet plumes. In the midst of all this is suspended the wheel of 10 spokes, according to the number of the Sephirot, and the sphere of Malkuth, indicating the governance of physical affairs. So he like leans like way heavy into the Kabbalah, right? So you get this idea of the stars of heaven, referencing the zodiac, right? When we talked earlier about the history of the symbol itself, right? We have the origins in the zodiacal wheel, the wheel of fortune. So we have that being filtered through the wheel, right, to influence the affairs on Earth, right? Very simple sort of way to talk about good old Crowley and his lovely writing. Crowley's writing is so dense that like you have to like chew on it for a while, but once you like unpack it all, you're like, whoa, that's like really intense. And I know there's a lot of people, just having watched in the community, there's a lot of people that are digging into Thoth this year. In fact, I know Lisa Pepez here in chat is also doing that. And the thing with the Thoth Tarot, right, is when you read books, whether, you know, it's Understanding Aleister Crowley's Thoth Tarot or whatever, right, which is the book I recommend to everyone who's interested in learning about Thoth. It's a really good, like, beginner resource. Eventually, you should read the Book of Thoth. And it's going to be very daunting, and you're going to be like, this guy is freaking nuts, right? But, like, when you unpack what's in there, it's really juicy, and it's delicious, and it's worth the time and the effort. So please do it. It's really good. Okay. All right. So in terms of the evolution of the meaning, right, the meaning stays pretty much the same. Levi is really kind of the oddball here when he talks about like this really masculine energy and the idea of the phallus. But in terms of the card itself, right, it leans into that idea of fortune, luck, good luck, success, right? It has a general, very positive sort of connotation to it. So there's nothing crazy there that changes over the course of history. So yeah, any questions before we dive into our section on the specific symbols within the Rider-Waite Smith? Is there a Chloe's Notes version of Crowley's work? I don't think so. I don't think so. And the Book of Thoth, the thing about that is it's available free online. If you just Google Book of Thoth, like PDF, there's like tons of, it's been in the public domain for forever now. So you can easily read it. It's out there. Nikki says, ironic that the card about the change is the one, the card about change is one of the ones that has stayed truest to the first depiction. It is a little interesting, right? You know, it's one of the cards I think that went through the biggest transformations in terms of its esoteric meaning, right? We see it evolve esoteric very deeply into the esoteric side of things, whereas other cards don't go through that similar transition. So that's interesting and intriguing to me. It is one of the cards that takes on a ton of additional symbols where a lot of the other cards don't. You know, like the sun and the moon, for example, those symbols and the symbolic representations on those cards stay very consistent through time, whereas here we see like a continual layering of symbolism, specifically esoteric symbolism, onto the card as time progresses on. Um, oh, Lisa said there's an official Kindle version that's like $5. So yeah, that's pretty good too. Yeah. And then it's still in print. You can still pick up at most occult bookshops or even on Amazon a copy of the Book of Thoth. I believe Wiser is the one that's still printing it today. And you can still even get it in hardcover. So, yeah, good stuff. All right. So let's dive into the symbols. Let's dive into the symbols of the Thoth card. Or the Thoth card of the A.E. Waite, Pamela Coleman Smith depiction of the Wheel of Fortune. So I hope everyone has a card that they can look at. We will pull up the card here so everyone can follow along. But the first thing we're going to talk about is the Sphinx, who is at the pinnacle of the wheel. He's way up here at the top, right? The Sphinx, again, it's a long-standing symbol of the keeper of knowledge, right? And in fact, this sort of depiction of the Sphinx appears in the Chariot in the Rider-Waite Smith, right? And Waite himself in Pictorial Key to the Tarot says that the Sphinx represents the equilibrium therein. That's a direct quote, right? So similar to the role of the Sphinx in the Chariot, we get that idea of perpetual movement of the wheel, right? So it's equal and constant, okay? Then we're going to dive into this guy over here, this little red devil-y guy, as a lot of people like to call him. He is Herbanubis or Anubis. Waite doesn't give any specific details in Pictorial Key 2 about this symbol himself. But this sort of figure typically represents the idea of ascension, transition, and change, right? He's the god that accompanies deceased souls through the underworld, right? So that, again, the idea of change from one state to another, right? And here, again, a lot of people get confused because there's kind of like an evil connotation to this, but that's not the case, right? When we take when we look at sort of the Egyptian tradition and ideas about death, right? It was an awesome thing. Like, yes, let's get there, right? And so this was a good thing. You were ascending. Again, this is why he is on kind of the upward movement side of the wheel, and he's ascending, right? And becoming more, right? On the other side of the wheel, right, on the left side, we have this depiction of the serpent, right, or Typhon. Typically, we see Typhon in some of the earlier cards, but this serpent represents a descent into darkness or sin, right? Again, this is a very sort of Judeo-Christian sort of ideology coming from the Garden of Eden, where man is led unto temptation by the serpent in the garden, right? But the other side of that coin is that prior to those religious traditions, right, serpents were seen as guardians and keepers of knowledge, right? And so, this can also represent a descent into a deeper understanding of things, right? So that through mishap and misfortune, we learn things, correct? Right? Sometimes the greatest teacher can be a mistake. So that's kind of where the serpent leans into. All right, so let's talk about the four winged creatures next. And the four winged creatures, I'm just checking the time here. How are we doing? Oh, we're doing great. Okay. The four winged creatures on the top and the bottom of the card. So on the top, you have like this angel and eagle looking thing. On the bottom, we have like this bull and this sort of like lion with wings, right? And they're all reading books, right? Keepers of knowledge. But this really represents the 4 living creatures of Ezekiel, right? The cherubim, the 4 elements, and the 4 evangelists, right? So we have earth, air, fire, and water being represented here, but also Luke as the bull, Mark as the lion, John as the eagle, and Matthew as the angel. So there's a lot to unpack in all of those things, and I'm not going to dive into that today because that's a whole nother like hour-long video. But right, you again have this quality of 4, and it's a number that comes up quite often, right? It's one of those sacred numbers like 3, or 7, for example, or 3, 6, and 9. But again, you have this division of 4, the 4 elements, the 4 disciples, or the 4 evangelists, etc. I just noticed, or it just jumped out at me, how all 4 have books. Yep, they all have books because they're there's no sort of extant primary source references as to why they all have books. So they can be the keepers of knowledge or the givers of knowledge, but also the whole idea of them writing their gospels, things like that. They can also reference the 4 fixed signs: Leo, Aquarius, Scorpio, and Taurus. However, the Aquarius one is highly debated, just because of a lot of things, but it is something that is associated with it. The symbol of Aquarius, when we get into the center of the wheel, is also mentioned later, which is where the debate comes from. Because people are like, well, why would it be there if it's also in the middle of the wheel? Like, why is it included twice? So there's a lot of debate around that. I tend to lean into it representing the 4 elements and the 4 evangelists, right? The living creatures of Ezekiel, because of the heavy influence of Judeo-Christian iconography in Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith's deck. When we look at the rest of their deck, right, it's full of those kinds of symbols and ideas. And I think that when people associate the zodiacal things with it, they don't it's not like it fits, but it's not perfect. And so for me, that's not something that I tend to lean into. But you can, yes, it is one interpretation. Now let's talk about the disc itself, which is probably the most fascinating part of this card. So per Waite, right, the design was influenced from Levi as a hypothetical reconstruction. The wheel is taken from the vision of Ezekiel. So again, here we have this reference to Ezekiel, which if you haven't read Ezekiel, it's one of the most fascinating sort of parts of the Bible, which is very, it's strange. If you read it from a modern perspective, it's strange. If you read it from an occultist perspective, you're like, it's a really interesting spiritual experience. It's just one of the most fascinating ones, right? But here we have inscribed on the wheel the letters T, A, R, and O, which can represent tarot, right? When we read it around, so T, A, R, O, T, tarot, right? Or T, A, R, O, tarot, right? It can also represent rota, R-O-T-A, right? For like the Wheel of Fortune, right? When we talked earlier about the history of it, right? Rota Fortunae, rota being the Wheel of Fortune. So there's that way to interpret it. But Waite is completely ambiguous here, doesn't really talk about it. So, it's here nor there. Now, on the inside of that, right, we find another circle, and inside of that circle there are a bunch of alchemical symbols, right? And we also have the astrological sign for Aquarius. Now, these alchemical symbols represent the 4 main elements of alchemy and the great work. So you have mercury, sulfur, fire, and salt. And then we also have the sign of Aquarius, and the assumption here is that it represents the Aquarian age, right? Which was a huge thing at the turn of the century, like moving into the age of Aquarius, and how it was going to be a religious reformation. It really kind of was, right? And again, that's a whole separate discussion. But again, this reference to alchemy, it's actually one of the few references to, like, direct references to alchemy that we see in Waite's work, but it does show that he was aware of it and thinking about it. And alchemy is, I think, one of those things that is generally misunderstood, and it is something that I do want to talk about more on this channel, because a lot of people assume incorrectly that alchemy was all about transforming base metals into gold, right? Or finding the philosopher's stone, aka the secret to immortal life. Now, yeah, those were both parts of alchemy, but those were really like base level sort of fundamental things of alchemy, and in a lot of ways that was the glamour. And when we talk about magic, when we talk about glamours, and especially in that period, when we talk about glamoring knowledge and secrets, you would glamour it as one thing, and if you were smart enough, you could see what lies beneath. And alchemy is one of those things where if you really study and really look at the history of alchemy and what they were talking about, it really wasn't about those two things. It wasn't about the philosopher's stone, and it wasn't about turning, base metals into gold. What it was about was spiritual transformation, right? That whole concept that the Buddhists put so eloquently of reaching nirvana. And so, it's interesting here that he chose to include the four base elements of the great work of alchemy on the Wheel of Fortune: mercury, sulfur, fire, and salt. So really fascinating to me. But yeah, so those are the symbols. Are there any questions about any of these symbols, or where they come from, or anything like that? We've got about 10 minutes left, so we're going to get things wrapped up otherwise. But yeah, that's it for the Wheel of Fortune. It's pretty straightforward when you break it down, but it's one of those cards that I think that when you're new to tarot really intimidates a lot of people, right? You look at it and you're like, holy crap, what is all of this about? But when you break it down piece by piece, right, there's a lot there. Oh, we didn't talk about one other thing. Let's go back. Hold on. I forgot about one thing. The Hebrew letters. We didn't talk about the Hebrew letters. So around the wheel here, we have Tarot, right? Tarot or Rota. But in between those, right, we have Yod, Hev, Vav, He, or the Tetragrammaton, or the name of God, Yahweh, right? So again, a direct reference back to those earlier depictions of the Wheel of Fortune with God at the center, right? Being in control. Very clever. A very clever reference to Kabbalah, a very clever placement of those characters, and a way of including that sort of symbolic meaning on the card. So, yeah. Wheel of Fortune. One of my favorite cards. And this, like, whenever I do these deep dives, it's difficult for me because they're each of the things that are sort of buried in this could have a whole nother hour-long video completely dedicated to it, and it's like history and origin. And I always try and design these sort of talks to be more beginner friendly, right? You had a question about the direction of the turning of the wheel from Ashley. I did not see that. So is there meaning to the direction the wheel turns in certain versions? Okay. So the idea of which direction the wheel is turning can have let me say this. There is no extant, meaning there is no primary source material that describes which way the wheel is turning symbolically. Normally the wheel is turning clockwise, and like academics and art historians believe that this is simply a factor of the idea of, like, you know, when you have a wheel on a cart and you move forward, it turns clockwise. Clocks go clockwise, right? And so that's just sort of the way they depicted it. There is that idea of perpetually moving forward and the inability to move backwards. Now, the interesting thing about Waite's card that I think throws a lot of people off is the directionality of things, right? You have sort of Anubis going up on the clockwise side and the snake going down on the counterclockwise side. I don't know if this was intentional or not, or the idea, I think one could maybe infer that maybe he was saying, even if life deals you a bad set of cards, right, you can still rise above that, right? Or you can take your misfortune and learn from it, right? There's a lot of different ways to interpret that. That could potentially be valid, but there is no definitive primary source material that says, oh, the wheel turns clockwise and it represents this, right? Most references to this contextually always just reference the wheel constantly turning, right? And that's kind of all we get. So yeah. Like, okay, name of God, but it feels like a big idea, and I'm like, okay, it's name. I don't feel like I fully get the Tetragrammaton association references to the tarot. So that's, so Lisa, that is strictly to deal with Kabbalah, and as you delve into the Tetragrammaton, which is a representation, right, of God, the Tetragrammaton itself could take its own video. I mean, that's a symbol that you could literally dive into for hours, right? But the Tetragrammaton, or the tetragram, or the, it's the 4-letter word Yod-Hev Vav-Hev, which is the name of God, right? Yahweh. And we see that translate into a whole bunch of stuff, right? Like you can spend hours researching the Tetragrammaton. So could you imagine the card titles if IKEA created? Oh no. Oh, you guys are awful. You're so funny. All right. Any other questions from chat? Also, if you're watching this in the future and you have any questions, be sure to leave a comment down below, and I will do my best to answer it. And if I don't know the answer, I will say I don't know and try and point you in the right direction. But yeah. This version of the card, the A.E. Waite, Pamela Coleman Smith version of the card, is one of my favorites. Oh my god, there is actually an IKEA tarot. You guys are ridiculous. Is there really? Oh no, there is. Oh goodness. Oh, and it's like done like their instruction manuals. How funny is that? Of course there is. That's so funny. Never ceases to amaze me. Perfect. Well, I don't see a whole lot of other questions with regards to the Wheel of Fortune. I will go back and correct that that edit. When I was writing, I had a crash when I was writing it, and I thought it saved because the one below it saved, but the one above it didn't. And I'll have to go back and fix that. Oops. But yeah, that's all I had to share with you guys today. Also the thing about spinning wheels. Yep, the spinning wheels are the common household. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Lots and lots of correlations there. And of course, again, it's a modern trope or meme that we see continued into today. Amazon just finished the first season of The Wheel of Time, and that whole book series and television show, which if you haven't read the books and you haven't watched the show and you're a fantasy fiction fan, you should. But the whole premise of that show is based on the idea that the wheel, right, continuously recycles people's souls and reincarnates them, and this whole idea of ages and everything that's happened before will happen again, right? That's a quote from Peter Pan, by the way. It's not from Battlestar Galactica. It's from Peter Pan. One of my most favorite quotes ever. Everything that has happened before will happen again. That idea of cycles, right? It's ingrained in our society and within our culture, and it's still used today. So yeah. Listen, Nikki, if you are a fantasy fiction fan, the Wheel of Time series is one of my all-time favorite series ever. The show is good. The books are 10,000 times better. And when you read/watch, please don't have expectations of them being perfectly aligned. Treat them as their own thing, but they are wonderful. They're so good. Oh, goodness. All right, I'm just catching up on chat here to make sure I didn't miss anything. Otherwise, we will get things wrapped up. We're right at an hour. We did really good today. I always feel so rushed when I do these because I want to get as much information in as possible. And again, there's tons more information in the blog posts. So if you have the time, go check out the blog. You can like on the blog. You can leave comments and questions on the blog as well. You can, I believe you can leave them anonymously. I can't remember now if you can or not. Or you can just register an account on the website. It's free. You don't have to share anything or anything like that. And you can even comment directly on the blog. So... The Wheel of Time was really good. I agree, Westar Tarot. I agree. All right. So let's get things wrapped up then. If you think of a question or anything, come back, leave a comment below. Come back later and let me know in the comments below what Wheel of Fortune card is your favorite Wheel of Fortune card, like from what tarot deck. One of my absolute favorites is from the New Chapter Tarot, by the way. So if you're curious as to what mine would be, that's one of them. And of course, the good old RWS one is also one of my favorites. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming to hang out with me today and take a deep dive into the Wheel of Fortune. I hope you guys learned something about this mysterious and enigmatic card that, generally speaking, intimidates a lot of new readers. But again, my goal with this series is to help you guys understand the evolution, the art history, and the meaning of the cards in a unique way, and I hope it's useful. There's a whole series of this videos, there's a whole series of this videos. There's a whole video series of videos just like this. If you're interested in learning more about the other Major Arcana cards, you can find that down in the description box below. And we'll continue to do these about once a month. So if you're interested, be sure to subscribe if you haven't done already, and click the little bell notification and hit all so you get notified of when I post new videos. And don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. It really helps the community to grow. And yeah, I really appreciate each and every one of you so very much. I hope all of you have an amazing Sunday. And as always, remember, everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. So be kind, always. Bye, everybody.